Hey, welcome back, everyone. I want to talk about some interesting stuff happening right now leading up to the 2024 elections, which is that, as we know, that there are many of the laws around elections have been changed, and these often get credited as benefiting Democrats more than they do Republicans. An interesting update has come out that Trump is planning to use all these new election loopholes that have been legalized. And of course, he's being criticized for it because, he used to criticize these things. His stance basically now is that this is the new normal and he's going to embrace it. And so all these different election loopholes, Trump looks like, at least they're saying publicly, he's going to use them. Be going into what these are and how that whole thing works. Also, you might remember back in 2020, Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta, formerly Facebook, was donating hundreds of millions of dollars to elections in ways that technically would violate some laws that the IRS normally would prosecute people for. People are wondering why he was not at least investigated, if not charged for that. While he's trying to do it again this year, and already some states are refusing to join on with it. And while they're also refusing to join on, Trump is actually calling for him to be charged actually for his actions. We'll see if anything happens with it, but pressure, of course, creates controversy, and controversy tends to make people a little more wary, I think, of doing things that could be illegal. And folks, also the head of the grand jury against Trump has been criticized because of some very bizarre behavior that she had on camera. We talk about these, many other issues, and folks, thank you for being here. Always a pleasure having you all here. Quick reminder, we will jump over to Epic TV after about 25 minutes or so those of you on YouTube and elsewhere, be sure to join us on Epoch TV. It's our uncensored channel. Again, I do an hour and a half show, and so a lot of it's there. The live Q&A is there, and you also help keep this show going because YouTube just plain old, I think, doesn't like me at this point. What are you going to do? That said, folks, jump into the first story. Let me show you this. This is actually Wall Street Journal, and it says, Donald Trump changes tune in mail-in voting and ballot collection. And it says, after years of assailing early voting, remember this was one of the changes they made to election laws with COVID, the pandemic. Because of COVID, Democrats mainly were able to change election laws across many states. And these changes to election laws that made illegal things that used to be illegal are credited as some of the big loopholes that people say very likely led to fraud, or at the very least, maybe changed the rules of the game in a way that is not quite fair. Mainly because Democrats do it, Republicans don't. Trump's saying he's done with it, he's going to do it, and so if those loopholes are there, he's going to exploit them. That's what he's saying. It says here, Donald Trump is having a change of heart. And it says the 2024 presidential candidate, this is Wall Street Journal, remains critical of various forms of early voting, advisors say, but his campaign is nonetheless mounting an effort to pursue such votes after Democrats excelled at doing so in recent elections. His team is studying state laws governing absentee and mail-in voting, as well as ballot collection, which people call ballot harvesting, it says by critics, in which third parties gather and turn in votes, people familiar with the effort said. So, ballot harvesting, early voting, mail-in ballots, Trump's getting on board with all of it, folks. Further, it states that Mr. Trump highlighted the move in a fundraising email this week stating, quote, this is Trump saying it, the radical Democrats have used ballot harvesting to cancel your vote and walk away with huge elections that never should have won. They never should have won. But I'm doing something huge to fight back. And Trump states our path forward is to master the Democrats' own game of harvesting ballots in every state we can. But that also means we need to start laying the foundation for victory right now. And in December, Mr. Trump told Breitbart News that the GOP, the Republican Party, has no choice but to, quote, live with the system that stinks, while maintaining, quote, a mail-in ballot will always be corrupt, and that Republicans should seek to change laws. In other words, Trump is not technically changing his position. He still disagrees with these altered laws. He still doesn't agree with them. But he says, you know what? Until we can change them, until we can get rid of them, they're there. They're being exploited. And if we don't exploit them as well, we're going to lose. That's his position. It's a very classic art of war here. This is very classic, I think, Trump style. Trump doesn't. In my opinion, Trump is different from maybe the Republican establishment because he fights dirty. And I know that that's often where people dislike him, including Democrats, ironically, even though he uses a lot of their same tactics. It's typically the left that does, cancel culture, personal attacks, name calling, naming and shaming, attacking people individually. Pretty much the whole system you have for that. Republicans usually don't play that game. They tend to see it as unpresidential. They tend to see it as mean and just not of good character. But Trump does it, and Trump's very aggressive with it. We see also that Trump is not afraid of basically playing their games as well, doing things that Republicans actually do regard as unethical, and that Trump himself has not changed his position on that he believes it's unethical, although not illegal because the laws have been changed. And he's now planning to use things that are legal, but that even he regards as being unethical in order to try to win the elections because, again, the rules of the game have changed, and he's aware of that. Before we go further, folks, we do have a sponsor today. Today's episode is brought to you by American Hartford Gold. Now, as we've been talking about, inflation is going to continue and actually get a lot worse. Even Fed Chair Powell is warning us to brace ourselves. Well, there's one way to hedge against inflation. American Hartford Gold makes it simple and easy to diversify your savings and retirement accounts with physical gold and silver. With one short phone call, they can have physical gold and silver delivered right to your door or into your IRA or 401k. They make it easy as well, folks. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A-plus rating for the BBB and thousands of satisfied clients. If you call them right now, they'll give you up to $2,500 of free silver and a free safe on qualifying orders, so don't wait. Call them now. That's 877-260-2764, 877-260-2764, or text Joshua to 65532. Again, that's 877-260-2764, or you can text Joshua to 65532. And folks, actually, I looked at the numbers recently on gold and silver. And I think gold in particular, anyone who did buy gold over the last few years is doing decently well. So we'll see how it goes. You never know with the markets, but it's been doing pretty dang well. All right, folks, that said, one of the other big things that people called out was the Zuck bucks, as they called them, the money from Mark Zuckerberg and the organization he created to basically bankroll the election systems. Now, he did this in ways that were we can't call them illegal because, we didn't actually look into it. It hasn't been prosecuted. But under any normal circumstance, the IRS would investigate, given the fact that there are basically politically biased campaign donations, donations to elections being done in ways that would swing things in favor of one party over another based on where he's given the money to. In other words, he found kind of a loophole within the election system in terms of campaign financing, it looks like. One that is possibly illegal, but we'll have to see if it ever gets prosecuted. It's running into controversy this year. In 2020, this was one of the main things cited, although there were many, that actually helped kind of swing the elections in favor of the Democrats. But it's running into controversy. Let me show you this. The Federalist has a story. Zuckerberg 2.0 recipients turn down money after leftist nonprofit fails the transparency test. And it says 3 of the 10 counties chosen as beneficiaries of a program from the nonprofit that helped fund the private takeover of government election offices in 2020 are refusing to accept those dollars leading up to the 2024 cycle. Keep in mind, folks, 3 of 10, that means that the majority of them are still taking the Zuckerberg cash. But it says election officials from Brunswick and Forsyth counties in North Carolina and Ottawa County in Michigan have chosen not to accept funds from the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence. That's the name of the organization. It's a program that plans to funnel $80 million in election grants to jurisdictions across the country over the next 5 years. The alliance is a project of the Center for Tech and Civic Life. That's the main one under Zuckerberg. It says one of two groups that funneled over $328 million of private money from Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, known as Zuck bucks, to government election offices, mostly in blue counties of swing states, mobilizing Democrat get-out-the-vote efforts and swinging the race in Joe Biden's victory. Now, remember, normally there are campaign finance laws. If you donate directly to a candidate, if you donate directly to a candidate, technically you can only give so much money to that candidate. Because if you exceed a certain amount of money, it might be $1,000 in some areas, or it changes state by state and election by election. But if you exceed that amount, well, you've committed a crime and you'll go to prison for it. Remember that that was why under the Obama administration, his administration, had Dinesh D'Souza thrown in prison. You might remember. Because Dinesh violated campaign finance laws, not in a major way. I think it was like a couple $1,000s. But he went to prison for it. Dinesh D'Souza went to jail for this. The case I personally investigated, looking into one of the former officials here in New York City, was again taking money from organizations with ties to the Chinese Communist Party. One of the main ones being the Fujian American Association, which was doing straw donors. They were violating campaign finance laws, and 2 people went to prison for it. And it was not a lot of money either. It was nowhere near, the millions and millions that Zuckerberg was giving. But what Zuckerberg is doing is, rather than donate directly to the campaigns, he's looking at the voting maps, saying what are the swing states that could swing the election, and he's giving the money specifically, mostly at least, to Democrat areas. So you could say that he's not donating to the Democrats technically, but he's donating to Democrat areas, which would mean more Democrat voters, which could constitute a pretty serious violation of election law. That could I guarantee if it was a Republican, they'd probably go to jail for a very, very long time for this. Let's put it that way. It says Democrat get out the vote. It says many jurisdictions chosen as recipients for the 2024 cycle, we know now, lean heavy Democrat and are located in swing states. As I just mentioned, this is the tactic they're using, indicating that CTCL is hoping to replicate its successful scheme in the next presidential election in purple states Democrats need to win, such as Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. While CTCL might once again try to hide its efforts by claiming the alliance is also giving money to red counties, because they did some of that in areas that actually didn't even matter so much. It says expect more than double or triple the funds to be spent on Democrat-leading counties compared to Republican ones, just like in 2020. So they donate to Republicans, but it's mostly to Democrat areas, which gives a good plausible deniability, although it is still skewed in such a way that it probably would violate the law if it were properly looked into. And under normal circumstances, again, the IRS would look into this. And again, people have gone to prison for things very similar to this in the past, including Dinesh D'Souza. It says Ottawa County Clerk Justin Roebuck told Real Clear Investigations he will refuse the grant money offered to his county because of transparency concerns. When Roebuck asked the Alliance about its criteria for the amount of money given to each county, those running the program refused to give a clear answer. And Trump is actually calling for Mark Zuckerberg to be charged criminally for this, interestingly. Now, this is what one of the big things is going to be changing come 2024. In 2020, a lot of things happened that took the Trump administration by surprise. A lot of things they did not expect. And there were a lot of rumors that turned out to have been false after they were properly investigated. Basically, there were a lot of fake breadcrumbs to follow. And when people followed those, they found that some were fake and some were real. The Trump administration, learned that lesson, and now with the Trump campaign, they can look back and say, okay, what proved to be true? What had the greatest influence on the outcome of the election? What can we legally replicate? And what can we call out that we cannot legally replicate? And it seems that Mark Zuckerberg's Zuck bucks are one of those things that they believe they probably can't replicate, but they can call out legally. And it says here, why isn't he being prosecuted? Trump goes after Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg, over just a $2 million grant donation to a Georgia election board. $2 million out of the $80 million they plan to spend, at least right now. And it says, former President Donald J. Trump called for the prosecution of Mark Zuckerberg over a report that a group connected to the Facebook/Meta CEO gave $2 million to a Georgia election board, a donation that may have violated state law. Why isn't he being prosecuted? Trump lashed out after Fox News Digital reported that a watchdog group is calling for an investigation into the flagrant and egregious violation of a Georgia state ban on private funding by DeKalb County Board and Registration of Elections. Registration and Elections. A prohibition that was put into place after accusations that left-wing donors had exerted influence over the 2020 elections. And quote here, this is Trump. He cheated on the election. The whole system is rigged. Why isn't he being prosecuted? The Democrats only know how to cheat. America isn't going to take it much longer. And Trump wrote this on a post on Truth Social, his own version of Twitter, alongside a link to the Fox News report on it. And in a secondary Sunday post, Trump returned to the theme of the 2020 elections, which he continues to insist was rigged against him, and suggested the 2024 election could be stolen as well. And he said, quote, crooked Democrat prosecutors, many of them racists in reverse, are trying to steal a second presidential election. They did it in 2020, and we're not going to let them do it again in 2024. MAGA, Trump wrote on his social media platform. In other words, Trump is not changing his stance or his narrative. He's maintaining what he said back in 2020. And again, it's going to be interesting because, look, back in 2020, many different factors had to basically be manipulated to have the outcome they did. And even then, the Democrats did not win it by a landslide. Biden won it by a very slim margin, and technically Trump still got more votes than any president in history, from what I understand. Which means Biden beat him somehow, right? But look, that included the need to change election laws across the United States, to put in hundreds of millions of dollars in potentially illegal campaign donations through the Zuck bucks, the manipulation of course, different issues I won't go into right now because I've gone over it too many times, but many factors were had to be at play in order to influence the outcome of the 2020 elections. And if Trump is going to get on board and start doing some of those things himself, and then calling out the ones that he can't do legally because, well, they're probably illegal, well, it's going to actually probably change the game quite a bit. It's an interesting approach he's taking. We'll see what it actually does, and even whether he wins the nomination. But again, we'll see. He is going to be speaking at CPAC, I believe, this Saturday. So, we'll see what he says. Folks, I'm going to jump over to Epic TV in a bit, but I want to address a few questions yesterday some of you had that I think are kind of important to address. One sec. I know several of you were asking me, how do we define far right and far left? Actually, there are multiple definitions of this, which is why I believe there's a lot of public confusion around what even defines the right and the left. I think this is one of the problems we have even as a country, that when people on the left talk about right and left, they're actually talking about a different right and left than many people on the right talk about. The way the dichotomy is framed is this. For most people who are on the left, Democrats, they define right and left only within the dichotomy of fascism or communism. They believe that the far left would be communism and far right would be fascism. The problem with that analysis is, one, it's not traditional. That was only changed under the Frankfurt School with this idea of the totalitarian mindset. And basically it frames right and left only within the boundaries of totalitarian socialism. The Nazis and the fascists were both socialists. Mussolini was the head of one of the major socialist parties. Hitler was seen as basically the leading system of socialism up until World War II. In other words, their system interprets right and left solely within the boundaries of socialism. which is not an accurate interpretation. People on the right typically would interpret the right and left on a dichotomy between totalitarianism and liberalism and freedom. And so they would put fascism, communism, all these things on the far left, totalitarianism, and they would place, of course, freedom and the idea in actually more like libertarian values on the far right, with anarchy technically being the end of it. None of these are actually the traditional interpretation of right and left, though. In fact, even the anarchists, if you go back into the early days of communism, were actually working very close with the communists. They believed you could. Goes back to Bernays and other individuals. They believed that you could achieve communism through internal internal anarchy, right? The breaking away from tradition, the destruction of hierarchy internally, that you could achieve a state of intentional communism that would bypass the government stage of socialism. Again, this was talked about pretty heavily in the older communist writings. The traditional view of right and left is actually more of a religious view. This goes back to the French Revolution, where the idea of the right wing and the left wing were actually framed. This is actually defined as right-hand path and left-hand path. It's rooted actually in the occult, technically. It's actually a dichotomy between good and evil. The left-hand path you could talk about from the Bible, for example, where they say that in the end days God will line the people up before Him, and the ones on His left will be cast into hell. Those on the right will enter the kingdom of heaven. Right, the goats and the sheep. Right, that's one of the ways it's framed. But if you go into the other texts, it goes into the definition of good and evil itself, which I'm speaking solely within the definition of how it's defined. I do not personally, I think it's a little more complicated than this, but the way that right and left-hand path, good and evil, are defined within these systems is this. There are two types of evil. One would be type 1 criminal magic, as it's called, and the other being type 2 criminal magic, as it's called. Magic as being things that influence the spiritual or mental realm, not like wizards and stuff like that. I'm merely talking about the definitions, right? I'm not saying I personally believe in this stuff. But the way it's defined is this. Type 1 criminal magic would be the first type of evil. This would be a social evil, one that's not necessarily actually evil. It could be something good. Basically, that means something emerges in society that challenges the existing beliefs, the existing moral values, or the existing hierarchy. You could say that Jesus, for example, emerging, during the Roman Empire and rubbing wrong with the Pharisees, was regarded as evil by both the Roman Empire and the Pharisees, and he was killed for it. Does that mean he was evil? No. It means that he challenged the existing system, and so he was attacked because of that, right? That is not necessarily evil. It merely means you're challenging the mindsets, the culture, or the values of an existing society. The true evil would be what you would call the left-hand path, and that would be type 2 criminal magic, which is the inversion of an existing moral system. It's where you would take an existing religion or an existing system of values, and you're not forming something new. All you do is you flip it upside down and you practice the opposite. For example, Satanism would be the type 2 criminal magic of Christianity, where, for example, people, rather than try to follow a different religion, would merely try to violate the existing moral system of an existing religion. If you go into communism, then, understand that what communism represents actually is a true evil interpretation of every culture and system. This goes to dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism being the living soul of Marxism, the basic way that communism is applied. And the way it works is through three principles: identify, contradict, and eliminate the middle. In other words, you identify the moral values, the religion, the culture of any society on earth. You flip it upside down, and then you practice the opposite and use the opposite to agitate the incumbent system in order to drag down the moral values. Communism, in this sense, would be considered a left-hand path religion technically, that could be applied to any culture, any country on earth. This is actually how right and left is traditionally defined. And if you go back to the origin of the definitions, that was it, as opposed to what we say now. We divide this now between conservatism and liberalism. Conservatism meaning you hold on to tradition, liberalism meaning that you believe in moving away from tradition, just based on the basic description of this. Of course, I would say things are not necessarily as absolute as this. There is a lot of middle ground, but traditionally, this is how right and left would be defined. So if you want to know what I'm talking about between right and left, typically I'm talking about good and evil. That's more my definition of it. I want to go into a couple other things, but I'll leave that for the questions later on in the show, because some of you had other questions they wanted to get into, including, one of you asked, because I think I gave kind of a hopeless take on things yesterday. I didn't mean to do that. Basically, one of you asked, do we only have a choice between the New World Order and the Chinese Communist Party run world order? It's not. I think there's a lot more hope than that. I'll get into that. Some of you are also asking about the Chinese police stations in the United States. I'll get into that as well. First up, folks, let's jump over to Epoch TV, and then I want to go into a couple more stories. I want to talk about the United Nations wanting global guidelines on internet free speech. I also want to get into this bizarre video that came out of this individual running the who basically was part of the trials against Trump, and why she's being challenged legally now after her very bizarre public appearance. It's going to be an interesting episode. Stick around, folks. We still have some time left, and so again, I do an hour-and-a-half show. Join us on Epoch TV for the second and third parts of the show. That said, folks, let me show you a quick trailer. You might remember, actually, I talked about some of this stuff, including communism, its occult origins, even the ideas of right and left. That was our Dark Origins of Communism series, which if you haven't watched, I recommend you do. It's a good series, I think, and gives really basic kind of outlines of these things. Let me show you that. We'll jump over to Epoch TV. In every country communism gains power, authoritarianism and death followed in its wake. Communism promises a world without suffering, and yet, in its execution, does the exact opposite. Following Lenin's death, Stalin's 29-year reign killed an estimated 60 to 66 million people. More famines and purges would occur. The very peasants that communism was supposed to benefit instead starved to death under its rule. The party dictates what is right and wrong. Mao ended up killing between 50 million and 70 million people. As an investigative journalist, I want to understand why. Anyways, folks, that's the series I did, The Dark Origins of Communism. It's a good series, 10 minutes or so per video. It's a short educational series. I recommend watching it. I think it actually really really answers a lot of basic questions of what communism is, how it works, and some of the ideas I've been discussing. Again, it's on Epoch TV. That said, folks, let's jump over to Epoch TV exclusively. And again, that helps our show keep going, so please support us there. I'll see you there. And folks, thank you for being here. Let's go deeper into some of this stuff. Those of you